In this video we're going to create some minimal techno with Arturia Pigments, but it's going to be some rather unconventional approach because instead of creating individual tracks with individual presets for like kick drum, melodic stuff and rhythmic stuff, we're going to fit everything inside one single patch. And you might ask yourself like, okay, why? And that's a very valid question, but I see in this some way of almost feeling dawless inside the DAW, because if you add some MIDI controller, you can basically control all parameters like the layers, so you can start layers, stop layers, filter stuff, which is actually enough to make some interesting arrangement out of it. And it's probably not going to be perfect, but it just forces you to play music, to perform music and to feel it more and to listen more instead of being kind of connected to your screen and tweaking around and kind of complaining that you're not able to finish your arrangement. And I highly enjoy this process and want to share with you in this video how you can set it up for yourself. First of all, hi and welcome to this video. My name is Yannis and I also made some more videos about pigments, so you already know that you can find more on my channel. And the first thing we need to do is create a MIDI clip and draw a MIDI note, because we're going to use the sequencer, which means we need to feed some constant signal into it. And here's already the first important thing, because we're going to create some 3/4 MIDI clip, so not like a 4/4 MIDI clip, because especially in minimal techno, you can often hear like some interesting interplay in rhythms, like some counter rhythms. So for example, I was listening a lot to Robert Hood and especially the track Minus, but also other tracks on this record are super fun. I think it's Minimal Nation. And you often have like the kick drum that gives you the steady 4/4 pulse together with some melody that creates some counter rhythm. And we're going to try the same here. So the sequence is a 6-step sequence and the tempo is 16th notes, which means it kind of creates some interesting counter melody together with the kick drum, which plays all quarter notes. And you could also use other numbers, so it sounds really interesting with 7 or 9 or 11, although it can also sound a bit brainy at a certain point. 6 against the quarter note kick drum is always going to sound really organic. And if you just listen to this melody isolated, you also have some trouble figuring out the one, because actually it sounds like the one is somewhere else, but you hear this repetitive pattern. If the MIDI clip contains a whole note or a 4/4 bar, the sequence will sometimes jump back to the beginning in the middle of the sequence, so it will not always keep on cycling through the whole sequence, which is something I don't want, and it would look like this. The sound for this melody is very basic, because you can see it's just a square wave with a little bit of FM synthesis from the second oscillator and also a little bit of unison detune, like little amounts. And otherwise you can use whatever you want. You can use a sample, you can use the additive engine. It's really not about the specific sound, it's just something I enjoy, like some very simple sound. But let's check out the kick drum, because it's important how it works. And I used the utility oscillator, so it's also creating some noise. We don't need it right now. I used this oscillator because it's very simple, but you can use it for actually in very creative ways. So here I have a sine wave. And important is that you unselect this one, because if this keyboard icon is selected, it means that it picks up the pitch from the sequencer or your keyboard. So the kick drum would be on different pitches, which is something we don't want here. We want the same pitch. So you unselect it. And then you just tune it down, and I ended up at -24 semitones. And in order to get this drum sound, you need to add some envelope. So in this case, I added envelope 3. You can see it here, just some snappy envelope that is assigned to the chorus with the value of 0.48. And this way we get this kick drum sound. Actually, let's mute the melody for now so you can only hear the kick. And of course you have to find a solution of making the kick only play quarter notes, because otherwise it would play all those steps from the sequence. And here I used a function envelope, and in this case function 1, it's applied to the output, so you can see that this is moving in the tempo of the quarter notes. So by default it's actually muted, but then it brings up the volume based on this envelope here. And it's important that it's on quarter notes. And super important is also this icon here, because if you click on the function envelope at first, it's always going to be on this icon, which means that it gets re-triggered by the input signal, like a sequencer. So we would have like 16th note kick drum if I play it now. which we don't want. So we use this icon, which means it just gets triggered whenever the sequence gets started, and afterwards it's just free floating with a quarter note pulse. And the drawing is also important because you need to listen carefully to the kick drum sound, because little changes like this can already take away some significant part of the sound. And also in the end, somehow I added this little bump, because if it started on top of this envelope, it sometimes missed the transient. I don't know if it's what's the reason, but after adding this, it actually worked better. So just listen to the stuff and be open for adjusting. It's not really some copy and paste thing, in my opinion. Now let's check again the sequence in relation to the kick drum, so you can understand this kind of rhythmic tension that is going on. You can leave the sequence like this, then it's going to sound the same all the time, and actually it can be some strong element. Nevertheless, the Pigment sequencer gives you very cool options for adding slight variations over time, or for just making the sound a little more interesting. And I want to share some of them with you because I used them. So for example, I chose different octaves. So here you can see it's like -1, 0, 0, -1, +1, -1. And also I added a little bit of this cube, which means there's some randomness added. So it's not always going to be -1 here. It can also be sometimes 0 or -2. And this counts for all of those individual steps. And I realized that with those minimal sequences, I like if they have like a wider range of notes. And just a personal thing, but I felt like it sounds cool here. And also I added some randomness to the gate length. So sometimes the steps are longer, sometimes they are shorter. Also a cool effect. And also you see that there's a higher randomness on the velocity, but actually not really for the velocity, because it doesn't really react to the velocity value from the sequencer. Instead, the velocity has some impact on the decay and release of the main envelope, like the VCA. So you can see here that there's a tiny range for the decay and a tiny range for the release, which means through this value, we just send different values for decay and release to the envelope, and add just some variation to the length of the sound, both through the gate length, but also through changing decay and release. And I just enjoy it because it makes the sound a little more vivid. And it's also important that you change the setting for the randomize auto regeneration, because by default I think it's on off. And this way it's actually the fastest setting, so every 16th notes there's going to be some new random value being calculated. It can also happen on slower tempos, but just so you know that this is also important. Now that we have the main melody and the kick drum, we can take a look at the routing, because Pigments allows you to create 2 individual chains, and that's actually super cool because the filters are on split mode, which means that filter 1 is one chain and filter 2 is the other chain. And then they also go into individual effect chains. So the chain of filter 1 can have different effects than the chain on filter 2. That means that we can put different types of effects on the kick drum than, for example, on the melody, which is really important, because if you put the same effect on everything, it sounds messy easily. And you can see that the main melody is actually being sent to filter 2, and the kick drum is being sent to filter 1. There's a second melody that I want to show you, but it doesn't play on all positions of this sequence, because that's only part of the first engine. So the second engine, it's in this case analog, it's super simple. So I think it's just, I tuned it up by an octave or 2 octaves, and it's just some sawtooth wave, like without anything. Also actually just a little bit of the detune here, but yeah, very simple sound. And you can again see that the volume moves, and it's exactly the same technique that I used for the kick drum, but with a different rhythm. So this time it's the function 2 envelope. And you can see that the rhythm is slightly different because it's a dotted 8th note. And this is kind of a similar rhythmic effect as with the 6-step sequence. It creates the same type of counter interplane. Just listen to it together with the kick drum, then you understand what I mean. And you can also hear those tiny glitches, which come actually from those sequencing variations, because they both happen in the kick drum and also in this channel. because sometimes the steps are longer, so those envelopes they are always the same, but the length of the steps isn't. So there can be sometimes a little bit of elements still inside the range where the volume is open, for example. And maybe you don't like it, but I actually like it because it kind of glues the sound together and adds this additional random glitchy element to the music. So it comes from those sequencing variations and also the velocity changing, like the decay. And you can see actually function 2 is not directly applied to the volume. This might sound a bit complicated now, but it's actually envelope 2 that receives the trigger from function 2, because sometimes I realize that I can shape the sound better with some envelope, but want to have the kind of signal for triggering the envelope created by function 2. You could also apply it directly. I don't know why I did it, but probably because I felt like I like the sound with the envelope more, but just so you know, you can directly apply the function 2 envelope as well. So just listen to it together with engine 1. Still, without the effects, it sounds a bit boring, but we'll turn them on very soon. And you can sense that there's some rhythmic tension building up, and also what I really like, it's something for a potential arrangement to just start with, for example, the second engine, because if you listen to it on its own, it sounds like a different time signature or a different rhythm. And by bringing in the kick drum, it can be some strong surprise element. By the way, in case you enjoyed this video, you're warmly invited to quickly click the like button and also to subscribe to this channel for more creative content around music production and also Arturia Pigments. Let's also check out this noise stuff. I really enjoy making those noise loops and I'm super intuitive about it. Like, I never really think much. I just go through those different modes and select something. In this case, it was noisy water drops. And there are a few things that I always try that are just super fun. So for example, for the tuning, I think I use some LFO to modulate it. So not this one. Yeah, so LFO2 modulates the tuning of the noise, and modulating the tuning of the noise always sounds really cool. I actually mute the other stuff so you can focus on the noise. And yeah, just use some filtering and see where you like the sound. And again, you see the volume changes as well. Again, the same trick, but triggered by a random envelope, like with the kick drum and the second melody. That, in this case, it's a binary mode. And the binary mode is great because it's either on or off. So for like random rhythms, it's perfect. So you see that sometimes we get a hit, sometimes we don't get a hit. And this way we get this funny sounding noise sequence. The second filter is really straightforward. It's basically like a hi-hat, just giving some regular 16th notes. But here you can hear the impact of the sequencer, because you can hear the difference in like the decay and also the length, which adds some activity to the figure. So it's not like some monotonous 16th note pattern. It actually dances a little, which I really enjoy. You can also see that I applied some little LFO to the filter 2 panning, so this melodic stuff and also this 16th note pattern, they just move a little for making it a little more stereo. And this first noise actually goes to the first filter, so it's like kick drum and noise 1, and the other elements are in the second filter. And also I haven't mentioned yet that it's just a tiny thing. LFO3 actually modulates the rate of LFO2 for just making the noise modulation sound a little more unpredictable. Just a tiny thing, but with noise I just like to try modulations and see what happens, like there's not really some big system behind it. Now let's check the effects, because they are also important. As I mentioned, there's one chain for the kick drum and one chain for the melodic stuff, or actually kick drum and this one noise layer. And for the kick drum noise layer, I went more for making it more punchy. So there's a compressor, there's some distortion, there's a bit crusher. You may consider also using some EQ for bringing out the bass more, because it's not the most bass heavy sound right now. It's more like some alternative minimal techno sound. But yeah, if you feel like you want more bass, you could also add it here. And I just want to show you the effect on the sound. Actually, I can do it here. So first let's check without the effects, and then I'll just turn them on at some point. And the second effect chain for the sequences focuses way more on some spatial effects. So you see delay, some tape echo, and actually some EQ for just taking out a little bit of the low end, making space for the kick drum, just a tiny thing. And again, I'll play it without and we'll turn the effects on after a while. Now it's time to set up some cool MIDI mappings, because of course you can listen to this patch as it is and it will always sound the same. But as I mentioned in the intro and as you saw me doing there, it's fun to create some sort of arrangement and to have some kind of progression inside the music. And MIDI is a great way for that, and once you have it, you can really look away from the screen because the patch keeps playing. You just change your stuff on your controller. It can be a very cheap controller. You just need a few knobs or pads, whatever you have. And I want to share with you what I think is really helpful for this type of patch. You always have some default Arturia mapping, which can be fine because it allows you to always directly use your controller once you have actually something that interacts with those MIDI notes, or if you have some Arturia controller, for example. But it can also distract you a lot, so I like to use some empty patch, so you can really focus on what's important in terms of what you want to change. And I want to share with you what I think is important. So first of all, you have to go to MIDI Learn, and I think it's important that you can just turn the layers on and off. So there's one mapping for engine 1, another one for engine 2. And you always just have to, when you're in learn mode, you just click on what you want to change once, and then you turn the knob or the pad, or click the pad that you want to use for it. For the utility engine, it's more important to have the individual layers. So actually, I want to have the kick, and I also want to have the noise layers. So here one and another one. And this way we can just turn them on and off, and it's already a lot what you can do by just starting or stopping certain types of sounds. Nevertheless, it's also cool to change filters, so we can also assign one to the cutoff frequency, and once you have a cutoff frequency, it's also fun to have some button for resonance, and we do this for both filters. And you can already do a lot with those settings. There are two more things that I think are really cool. So if you go to the effects, and I think effects A are fine, but for B, I like to have some controls for the dry wet knob, because this allows you to organically bring in effects. And that's basically what I used in this little example in the beginning. But yeah, you can choose your own mappings, but this is what I like. If you're interested in creating some cool generative ambient music with Pigments, you're warmly invited to check out this video. And also here I have some little collection with 10 generative Pigment sequences that you can also use to learn how you can use Pigments as like a standalone instrument. Apart from that, I wish you lots of inspiration with whatever it is that you create, and really hope to see you soon again at this channel. Bye!